It's wonderful to be here in York. I come from Singapore. And just a brief history behind that. Singapore, obviously, has a shared history with Britain. And it's often been cited by some of the early British literary greats, people like Joseph Conrad, Rudyard Kipling, and Somerset Maugham. And quoted, the letter has been quoted by the Raffles Hotel in Singapore that you can find basically all the fables of the exotic East in Singapore. And hence I joke to my colleagues that one of the reasons I'm here is simply because of that, as opposed to some of the work that I do. Nonetheless, Singapore and Britain has a shared history. It's a 200-year-old history. And a lot of it stems from this handsome lad over here, his Sir Thomas Stamford Finchley Raffles. He came to Singapore in 1819. Incidentally, his father was a Yorkshireman. He came to Singapore in 1819, and through his decisions, he managed to get Singapore established as a British colony in 1824. Now, with that, we remained a British colony through a good period of time, interrupted only by the World War II. And thereafter, sometime later in 1963, you guys did a Brexit on us. Yeah. I had to throw that in, but only this time it was successful, Brexit. So what happened really then in 1963 was that it ended 144 years of British colonial rule. Now, the merits of colonization can be debated to no end, but one of the legacies that has been left behind by Raffles is really the establishment of the then Raffles Museum and Library. And that is really can be traced to why I'm directly here today. The Raffles Museum and Library was established in 1849. And in 1887, it moved to its permanent location where it stands today. And today it's known as the National Museum of Singapore, where I am from. And hence, if you could trace that, really the reason why I'm here is because a Yorkshireman planted a seed some 200 over years ago, conceived a child who established a British colony, which founded a museum and led to me being here today, 200 over years later. The National Museum is, of course, Singapore's oldest museum, and we like to pride ourselves as having the youngest soul. In 2006, we underwent a redevelopment, and that was when we managed to add a new annex building at the back of the National Museum. We added about 4,000 square meters of exhibition space in that. And what happened was it also marked a kind of departure where we started to look at how we can program ourselves a lot better. So it's not just about the exhibitions, but also programming. And the spaces allow for that. One of the things that we did then in 2015, which is when we celebrated the 50th Jubilee of, of Singapore's independence, was to consider how can we revamp the permanent galleries and make it relevant. Now, if you were to trace the timeline, 2006, for context, the iPhone wasn't yet commercialized. And you can imagine visitor patterns have actually changed quite a fair bit since that time, between 2006 and 2015. Now, everybody has a device on their hands, and they are able to use that to access information, content, and hence this thinking behind museums as we are undergoing the revamp. What do people actually want of museums? And it is not just about accessing information, not just about accessing knowledge, but that's still important, but they want something more, and museums become more of a social and civic space. So as we were undergoing the revamp of the permanent galleries, we had that firmly in our minds. How can we make the museum socially relevant? How can we make it such that we place the people at the center of our development framework? We emphasize a lot more on the people interactions in terms of how we design the galleries, how we design our experiences. One of the major projects that we were able to embark upon was this. What you see on my right is part of a collection, or painting from the collection of natural history drawings, the William Farquhar collection of natural history drawings, which documented Singapore's flora and fauna over the past, in about 200 years ago. We have 477 drawings, and we wanted to challenge ourselves. Can we make this 200-year-old collection relevant to a young contemporary audience of today? And we had the opportunity to then create an immersive installation, digital installation within the National Museum. I'm just going to play a quick video for that. So this was our first venture into a digital immersive installation at the National Museum. Of course, we were fortunate that we had the funding from the Jubilee celebrations to allow for this. But really, what happens was that we created a space where the drawings were rendered into digital format and recreated into, and reimagined for that matter, into an installation which visitors could go into. Now, the technology itself, of course, is amazing, but what was more heartening is really the social interactions that happened within that space. We allowed for people to go and explore the collection in a different form, and they were able to have conversations. They were excited. We had an app, actually, which allowed for people to collect and catch the animals that you see up there. But that's almost secondary. It's almost like Pokemon Go, but in this case, the experience, the immersive experience that they were in was all the more striking. We started to see the potential of that and created programs related and embedded within that space. So we had programs that catered to different demographics, to seniors, to families with young children, toddlers even. We brought in some programs related to people with additional needs, like autism, who found the space particularly calming, not something we designed for, but something that occurred and happened. And with that, we were pretty emboldened from this process to start to explore a little bit more in terms of what are the other opportunities that digital technology can offer. And we started looking a little bit closely at augmented reality, virtual reality, and what that could do. So this was another project that we embarked on, the first augmented reality project that we did. Now, what you're seeing now is a device. Of course, the experience is built on the Google Tango platform. And what we did was essentially recreate virtually the main rotunda of the National Museum and other spaces based on 1950s photographs of that space. As visitors would go on an architectural tour, they would have been able to whip out the device at certain points and see the space recreated and approach the objects virtually through the device and kind of interact with it. Now, what is important about this that I wanted to highlight is not so much the technology, but really the thinking behind it. And it's really placing the social and the people interactions at the center of it. We, of course, had the option to run this as a completely self-guided tour in that sense. But we felt strongly that that shouldn't be the case. There is still a fair bit of barriers to people using technology, devices for that matter, and hence we placed the people who were delivering really the tours at the center of our development framework. We worked very closely with the docents to design the experience, to make it intuitive for visitors in terms of where the different stops should be. And it was a purely guided experience. Visitors would sign up for a tour. You have a human guide that you're talking to, you're working with. And at certain junctures, appropriate junctures, you whipped up the devices. And people had a choice. They had a choice of whether they wanted to use the device or they would rather not, or they would rather just have conversations around it. And this is where I think it requires a little bit of a mindset shift. Often when we try to introduce technology, we tend to want to let technology take the lead. But what we found is really that you have to consider putting the people, the audience at the center of it, and what would they want, and not so much what we want. So following on from that project, we embarked on a little experiment, if you will. I applied for some funding and secured some funding for the next 2 years to run a program called DigiMuse. Now, the term DigiMuse, what may come to mind to you is digital museum, considering I'm working in the museum space, but that would not be entirely correct. When I came up with the name, I really went back to the etymology of the term muse. And as you know, it really refers to in Greek mythology, it refers to the 9 goddesses who looked after arts and science. But it's also an expression for creative imagination. And it also connotes a very deliberate thought process, something that you muse over, something you think hard about before you implement. And I think that is really the mindset that we want to take with regards to implementation for digital and technology. If it's not necessary, if there's a better, more efficient way of doing it without the use of technology, by all means, go that way. So the use of technology has to add value to the experience that you're trying to create and not put technology at the forefront. We allowed for an experiment, and we brought in some virtual reality programs as part of the first run of DigiMuse. And this is where we brought in some 28 films that were created in VR. And we wanted to expose our audience to the medium. We took this opportunity to gauge their responses, so it's not so much about us just throwing them there and then kind of putting it out there, but we were actually doing active studies to try to understand their behavior patterns and really try to understand, is this what do we need and not necessarily what we want? And that distinction is always important. I always say one analogy that I can draw is technology is like wine. You know, you can have a great vintage, but it's always better when you share it with someone. And often when what you remember at the end of the day is not so much the year or the vintage of the wine, but really the interactions that you have around it, the people you shared it with, the stories that were told around it. And on that same note, I think we need to bear in mind that it is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, and that's often said. So following on from the first experiment in that sense where we introduced people to VR and we gauged certain responses, we decided to do an open call. And with this, through the DigiMuse platform, we did an open call to creators in Singapore, multidisciplinary creators. We didn't limit it necessarily to one particular sector or other, but just left it pretty open to say that, okay, if you have a proposal with the use of digital technology that can enhance museum experience, or in the area of art and creatives, we'll be happy to hear from you and we'll be happy to support projects like this, prototypes. From the open call, we supported 10 projects, but 7 were presented in August of this year.
An excavation through time is a fun and social VR experience that allows visitors to play together and allowing them to pick up physical tools to dig for artifacts that have been excavated locally in Singapore. I think technology has been used in interesting ways so that viewers and visitors can escape physical constraints which are common to the museum experience. Something that I was very interested in was to find a way to bring visitors' bodily experiences and sense of physical self into a virtual environment. So with this, we wanted them to physically pick up the tools and dig for these artifacts.
So this was one of the projects that we supported. And at the center of the evaluation, when we were kind of looking across the projects, we really wanted to play up the aspect of social interaction, looking at the human interaction elements of it, not so much what VR can do, but how do people interact with it? How can they gain value from it? With this project, we insisted that the developers look at a multiplayer kind of scenario. So it's not a solo player putting on the headset and just be immersed in your own world, but we wanted 2 players to be able to connect with each other virtually and physically, to talk to each other, to collaborate and discover the objects, dig up the objects. And from there, they have conversations while they are going through the experience. But at the end of it, we presented this within the main Singapore History Gallery. At the end of it, when they complete the experience, they actually see the actual objects that were discovered, physical objects, the artifacts are in a showcase just beside, and they continue the conversation thereafter. So once again, it's really having that thought process to say that the experience doesn't stop when the technology stops. How do you continue that? And technology allows for all of that. You talk about AI, you talk about chatbots. These allow for you to extend the conversations beyond the museum galleries, and I think that's something we are quite conscious about, of what we can do with that.
Project Insight is a conservation of artwork where we demonstrate to the public what is the process that a conservator actually takes to bring it from its poor damaged condition to a restored state. Project Insight is catered to a wide range of audience, starting from families to even professional curators. In mixed reality, we can actually have a collaborative experience whereby multiple users can use a device and explore the exact same mixed reality world. And from there, you're able to see in different views. You're able to see the past, the present, and even the future through mixed reality technology.
This project is really that collaborative space that we can work within. So users would have been able to put on the device, they would have been able to be guided by an actual conservator putting on another headset, and they would have a better appreciation of the process of conservation. Often visitors visit the museum, they see the actual artifact, in this case a painting, and they tend to neglect or don't really think about the process behind it, but hundreds of hours of conservation work had actually gone into it before it goes on display. So through this project, we really wanted to bring that out and once again have that conversation between the curators, the conservators, and the visitor to allow for increased value in terms of what they will get out of this whole experience. And really, I think, end of the day, what we are trying to advocate is that you have to place the people, the human interaction, the social components at the center of your design process. It can't be something that's left to chance. It's something that has to be planned for ahead of time. Not all the time it will work, but at the same time, it's really about experimentation. And it's also about not what the technology can do, but what people can do with the technology. And that's important to take note of. The last thing is really, I think, if we are able to adopt this framework, placing the people interactions, having that at the forefront, I guess we can move, hopefully, away from kind of a blurred reality kind of mode and looking to incorporate a more intuitive, a more social, a more relevant experience for all, regardless of realities. Thank you very much.